Klal was traveling in the Midbar, in the desert, they had a sign that would tell them when they need to travel and when they need to rest. And this was based on the cloud. They had a cloud protecting them. The cloud would start moving up, then they would gather their stuff. This would be an indication that they're about to start traveling. The Baal Shem Tov says the travels that our forefathers went through in the Midbar, every single one of us has to go through before we can get to the other side, to the promised land. Because this is the nature of how the world develops, that every unit that's coming into creation contains within it the entire history that made it become. And this has to be this way because the nature of time is such that one moment gives to the other moment, gives to the other moment. Not existence. Existence cannot be given over from one moment to another moment because existence comes from somewhere else. But the forms, the shapes, the colors, the sizes of existence, the location of all the different objects and all the different forces, this evolves over time, gets given over time. And this reality is the form of who we are. And so in order for me to be a part of this reality, if there's going to be a new unit that's going to join this reality, I need to be updated on the entire history that got us to this moment. And that happens in the womb. Most of the evolution that we need to go through from our own history happens before we are even born. When we already have the shape and the size of the human body, it means that we've already caught up to most of where humanity is up to, but there's still a portion that we still need to finish after we leave the body, after we leave the womb. Because there's the part of the information, there's the part of the interpretation, there's the part that man has added to reality since man learned to speak, that this cannot be given over in the womb. This is something that requires a certain development within the brain, within the organs. And so this part happens after we leave the womb. And this is what's today formally known as getting an education. Getting an education simply means that we're going to update you. All the history of what humanity have learned, all the norms that are currently being enforced, we're going to teach you so that you can become a member of this society. You can have your update from what nature developed within you to now know what man has developed within you. And so in this process, we're going to go through the entire history of humanity. In order for a human being to be shaped, in order to fit in to a certain society, he has to go through the entire history that brought them to become that society. So in some form, in some fashion, all the inherent traumas that caused a people to be a certain way are going to be given over in order for the future member to fit in. so that they have all the instructions and they know how to be what the people around them are trying to be. And so the most formative years of our nation, the most formative years of our history, are the 40 years after they left Mitzrayim until they came to Eretz Yisrael. These 40 years are against 40 days. These 40 days are against how long it takes to form a child in the womb. So after 40 days, there's already a formed child. We can already tell which gender it has because it already has all the parts. And so after 40 days, the child has already enough formation that it can fit into the reality that has been created for it. So now it's already becoming a part of us to a certain sense. It already has its own identity. And so the 40 years in the Midbar are the beginning of the formation of Klal Yisrael. And so everything that's going to happen there is going to be formative for the entire experience. It's going to dictate what's going to happen thousands of years down the road because this is the original formula that made it happen so. And so that's why we have this history, that's why we have this information, so that we can reflect back and try to relate to what's taking place inside of us, because everything that was created before is alive inside of us. We, as a lens of perception, can perceive everything that is. And everything that is includes everything that was. Whether it was right, whether it was wrong. If it was, then it's alive inside of us. And so when we're going through this development, when we're getting this education that's not happening through humans, education that's happening internally. The real education is not what we're being told. The real education is our internal reaction to what's taking place. Our internal reaction to the words that are being said. A child grows up in a home that has a certain behavior. Maybe they learn to do that behavior, or maybe they learned never to do that behavior. One of those two, depending on what was the internal reaction, what were they learning, what was the real education they were getting. Maybe the education was, this is something you never want to do. Don't copy us. That's also a form of education. And so the real education is happening between us and the one who is Melamed Torah L'Am Yisrael, the one who teaches us. Our teacher is the one who is in charge not of the information coming in, but of how are we going to react to this information. That's our real teacher. From him we're always learning. And so in this process, we're going to learn whatever needs to be learned so that we can catch up with where we are. We're somewhere. We're not in a random place that it doesn't make a difference. We're somewhere very specific. Humanity has traveled down a path and they've gone through certain mistakes in how they understand reality, and therefore they have moved to a very specific place that is not their natural place, but it has a specific form of a relationship to the natural place that we have to try to understand. And so each one of us will go through this if we try to live our lives fully. Some of us will turn away and say, this is not for me. I cannot try to make any sense out of this, and I'm just going to survive, and then we'll figure it out afterwards. But this is a dilemma that we're going to face regardless, because as life happens, we're interacting with a reality that we don't understand. People think very differently. People come to different conclusions. People have different histories. People have different understandings of right and wrong. So when we're learning, we're going through the process of our forefathers. Masei Avos, Siman Labanim. What happens to the parents is a sign to the children. What's the sign? It's a sign that now it's running inside of you. Now this is alive inside of you, and therefore these patterns are going to appear. These are the patterns that made you. And so these patterns are going to appear. So what do we find if we observe the process? If we're going to be tested like the people were tested in the Midbar, what is the process of being tested in the Midbar? What happens? Where they get it wrong? Because they got it wrong. They got it so wrong that the pasuk says, "V'heim lo yadu derachai." They didn't get it, even though they were called the Dordea, meaning they knew the most. They knew more than any other generation. They saw undeniable things, and yet they didn't get it. It didn't resonate. And where did they fall? That no matter how many times they saw, that at the end things are different than they appear, at the end things work out differently, at the end the plan is not what it seems, it's better, they still couldn't trust. They still couldn't rely. They still couldn't go with it when suddenly it appeared that this time it's really messed up. This time it's different than all the times. And this is again and again and again the same theme. All 10 times, essentially, they're losing morale, they're losing belief, they're losing hope because of a temporary issue. And they've seen so many times that even big issues get resolved, and yet the next time it comes around, and here they are again, as if nothing ever happened. And so this is at the core of it. This is at the core of human failure. Human failure because these were the people who were supposed to be the ones who don't fail. This is the best humanity had to offer. These are the people who saw Kriyas Yamsef. Ra'asa shivcha layam, mashal roi cheskel. You have the lowest of the people seeing what the highest, what the prophet didn't see. And then we have kabbalah satayra, keviyachol. They know, and it's not enough. Knowing is not enough. Many people today believe if they saw a miracle, then things would change. But this is only because we don't have miracles, so we can fool ourselves. A miracle is good while it lasts and while we remember it accurately. And how long is that? And then it's just yesterday's news. Today seems different. Now there's more important things to be busy with. This is human nature. This is not something that we can negotiate. We forget. We don't realize. How do we know? Because we're seeing a miracle every single second. This is a miracle. We are a miracle. We're just used to this miracle, so it doesn't count. It's a boring miracle. We want an exciting miracle. The demonstration is here. If anybody can do this, they can do anything. Can there be anything someone that can do this cannot do? Could it be that he cannot intervene in his creation? Could it be that this is just happening and there's nothing behind it? But what's wrong with us? We're used to it. We've seen it yesterday. It's almost meaningless. This is because we're looking from the wrong part of the brain. We're not aware of what this really means, how big this is, how meaningful this is. As long as we have it, we don't realize. We take it for granted. There's nothing here to be taken for granted. None of it makes any sense. If it wasn't so stubborn about constantly being there, it would be much easier to deny that it even exists. And yet here it is. We have to deal with it. We're in it. It's happening to us. And so this weakness, that we get used to things, that the mind just takes things for granted, takes things as if it's understood and therefore it's no longer important. This weakness is what didn't allow the most perfect, the most qualified to realize their own truth, to realize their own power, to realize what they are capable of and what they were meant to achieve. There was no gain from what they did. It was pure weakness. There was no sinister intentions. They didn't try to manipulate in any way. They really couldn't stand the test. Either they were too afraid about having water, or they were too afraid about going to war, or they were too afraid about the conditions that they have to deal with. But it wasn't something that was very sophisticated. It was a very basic weakness, a weakness that we all still suffer from at all times. And so to conquer this weakness, to realize the guidance that is constantly taking us to where we need to go, we need to realize that in our life also, there's the cloud that's leading us. If we look back in our lives, if we look back at our history, if we look back at the history of the individual or the history of a nation, we see the circumstances and how they're interwoven, how people do things that cannot be explained rationally, and yet there's something that's driving them, that's making them do whatever is necessary to be done, because it's coming from somewhere else. It's all coming from somewhere else. And this is the truth. This is the only truth. And this truth gives us power if we can hold on to it. This truth allows us to go through whatever the circumstances are and know that there's a purpose, there's a meaning, there's a reason. It's worth it. Somehow it's worth it. Somehow this is what's right. And even if the mind cannot comprehend. The mind cannot comprehend how it got here, and yet it is here. The same way the mind got here, in that same way all the circumstances came. Everything came the same way as the mind. The mind doesn't get to choose what suits it and what doesn't suit it. The mind's not qualified to know. And where does the mind try to know? It only looks at the places that it doesn't appreciate. That's where it digs. That's where it wants to know. Those are not the places that the mind is going to be able to explain. Because those realities are a result of so many different things that are broken. So many different areas where life is not the way that it was intended to be, that we won't be able to tell all the different influences that eventually resulted in the details that happened in our life. There are too many things that need to be repaired before life can make sense to us. And so rather than trying to make sense, it's trying to make it better. If these people would be at the level to be practical, they would realize that what they're doing is not going to help. They weren't doing anything that was going to give them any resolution. They were simply allowing their frustration to take over, and then they lost. Then they lost because they went to war with their only source of resolution. The one that has all the power, which is Moshe, Hashem, the one that's leading them, the one that's giving them everything that they have, that's exactly the place where they went against as soon as they lost morale. And this is very similar to us in the sense that when life doesn't go our way, who do we take it out on? The poor spirit living inside of us that's been giving us and giving us and giving us and taking all our different patterns that are hurting it, and yet it continues to give and to give. And as soon as there's any frustration with anything that's going on in the world, we give it straight there. And so we are doing on an individual level what they were doing on a collective level. So this strength, this realization is what gives the spirit its dignity back. If the spirit was here and everything was random, that's a life that's not worth living. A random life is not worth living. If life is meaningless, then what would be the point? Nobody's enjoying themselves enough that life should be justified based on what happens here now. And so life has to be about something else. The spirit knows that. If we take that away, the spirit becomes desperate and goes into denial. And then it needs a lot of distraction in order to keep running from itself. And so the salvation is simply the truth. And when the spirit doesn't know that the truth is its salvation, that's when it's in exile. The definition of exile is that one thinks that the truth is their enemy. As soon as one thinks the truth is their enemy, now they no longer have a home. The truth is the only home. And this is something that the spirit cannot face. And so it will find even pain, even suffering, to be busy with, rather than to realize that it doesn't have a home in the truth any longer. Salvation, redemption, is the realization that there is no place more safe for anyone than the truth. The truth is the place where everyone is welcome. The lies create worlds where some people are excluded. The truth doesn't have a world where anybody is excluded. That world doesn't exist. And so being able to return to realizing your relationship with the truth is what redeems us from exile. And that's the process that they were trying to realize. What they had in the 40 years was a form of exile. They couldn't go into the promised land. And then, even when they went into the promised land, they never realized the ownership over it. The closest they had was in the time of Shlomo. And even then, it wasn't what it should have been. And so, exile was a constant reality. Why? Because the people were not strong enough to face reality. The people were not strong enough to realize that the truth is their closest ally. They were looking for distraction. They were looking for guarantees. They were looking for someone that's going to represent what's really going on before we can give a commitment to do the right thing. And so they couldn't have redemption. They weren't redeemed from the mind of slavery that they inherited from Egypt. They couldn't let go. And so when there wasn't a master, when there wasn't a direction, when there wasn't the right support, and suddenly they can't do it. They're not up to the task. This process is what leads us to somewhere that's even more dignified. Every process that we go through that delays redemption, it means that it adds something to redemption now. Redemption has to be more now because something new was added. Now there was an additional delay. So from the Chet of the Etzadas, every single delay, after the delay, the additional work has to be paid for. So we've had many delays. We've had so much progress in the hidden dimensions, but in the external dimensions, almost nothing but delays. And this means that what's going to come is going to be even more powerful from two sides. Also because of what we just said. If there's a delay, there has to be additional compensation. Even more so because the delays have taken us further and further away from reality. Further, meaning our conditions, our perception of what's real is much worse than what it was before. And so therefore, when reality is going to be revealed, it's going to be that much sweeter, it's going to be that much more distant from what we're used to, from what we thought reality is. So may we merit that reality should be revealed to us individually and collectively, and may it happen soon.